I want to get back a little bit to gender and to, if we
Yeah.
can, what might be like the biological underpinnings of gender, because we
Mhm.
recognize it's a social construct. But I've read some research that seems to suggest that there is sexual differentiation that occurs in development, and that
Mhm.
there are these connections to natal hormones that potentially the hormonal environment may shift during the process and lead to something of like a hardware software disconnect with the final product. I know that these
Yeah,
are
dude.
silly ways of describing it, but how accurate, if at all, is that framework?
It's very so. Here's okay. So what's really important to remember is again we have to define gender. That gender is a fluid term. It is a
Mm,
social construct. What gender actually is, well, the definition, right? Gender is an individual's expression of their expectation and their society's expectation of their perceived biological sex. That's what gender is, right?
mm.
And so that shifts from generation to generation, from culture to culture, from person to person, from day to day. Like it's all over the place. It doesn't make any sense. Um, and so that's something that when we look at it on the face, we're like, okay, well, then we can't possibly say that there's a biological underpinning to that. But there kind of is, because
Mm.
when we look across the animal kingdom, we see, things that were example, just off the top of my head. Where are they from? Whiptail lizards. There's a species in Nevada. I'm 99% sure, or somewhere over there in the west southwest. That they are all female, completely female species. They reproduce through parthenogenesis. The females just make more females all the time. And that's just how they live. It's radical, cool, right? Miraculous evolution. They're not even close to the only animal that does this. But they are interesting because in order for a female whiptail lizard to make more female whiptail lizards, they have to mate with another female whiptail lizard. One of the other females will do a whole mating dance, a whole courtship dance, and act very distinctly not female, and then will climb up on top of the other female and do a whole pseudo copulation. They do all the motions as if they're having penetrative sex. And then that triggers hormonally in the receiving female to produce eggs that are now completely fertilized all by herself, and she makes more lizards. So there you have a concept of what you could call a gender
Sure. Yeah.
in these fucking lizards. I see one of the people just popped in chat is it's a New Mexico whiptail, so not Nevada. Pardon me. In that desert area, it might be the New Mexico whiptail that extends up there because we have like Texas tarantulas here in Oklahoma. But
Right.
like I remember the paper was from that area, and so like we see like this really cool concept of gender in a completely unisexual species. And when we talk about, I mentioned a little while ago, homosexuality in the animal kingdom, that we've seen over 1,500 animal species exhibit homosexuality. We've
Hmm.
seen reverses in what you could call typical gender roles, like, for example, in hyenas. Female hyenas have a fully erectile penis that does nothing. It's not a real penis, it's a pseudo penis, but it's still erectile. And they are
Erectile
the dominant
pseudo
one.
penis is a concept that
Erectile
I
pseudo
was
penis.
previously unfamiliar with. I still don't feel like I understand it, but I'm gonna repeat it like it's my favorite band.
Right. And they actually they're it's a totally matriarchal society, and they actually bully the males into reproduction. Normally you would imagine a male would have an erection if they were like feeling good and feeling excited and ready to do, but actually when a male hyena is terrified and scared, that's when they get an erection, because the female will bully him into having sex with her. Crazy. If you ever want to learn about the worst possible way to meet a
Hyena
male, learn
fear
up.
boners. Got it.
Yes, study up on the horrible life of male hyenas. Um, we look at clownfish. Another just fun
Mm-hmm.
example. All clownfish are born male, and then one of them will transition to female and develop female gonads, and then that will be the one that reproduces. And so, like, you have these really fluid concepts of what gender is, even if you look out at the animal kingdom as a whole. And it's really important to remember each one of these species is individual. We can't say hyenas do it this way, therefore humans do it. You know what I mean? Like, we can't make that connection. But what we can do is say it's not as fucking simple as the man go get fish and bring home and then have love with wife and then babies. And like, it's just not that simple, especially not when we look again at human cultures across history, where we see that the vast majority of cultures throughout history were polygamist, but the vast majority of relationships throughout history were monogamous. And we see that we have this hierarchy, this power structure of what a civilization allows versus what people actually want to do. And we see several different cultures which have a third gender, or a gender that is specifically dedicated to sexual subservience, or a gender that is kind of fluid, and it really depends on who's on the giving and or the pitching and the catching end of situations. We see cultures where we have a totally different concept of gender roles and what they are and what they're for and what they mean. And again, this misunderstanding comes from the sheer dearth of feminism in archaeological literature. We go back and we review some of the big names in ancient archaeology, and we're like, the men go out and kill the thing and bring it home, and the women are weaving and making pots. And we find out that none of that is based in anything but the author's own biases.
Just assumption.
And we're learning more and more and more and more and more and more and more that humans have found lots of ways to be humans, and that our model, the very puritanical male and female reductionist binary model that we were all taught in school, is a great place to start, but it's just not the whole story.
Sure.
And it's like, if I taught a class of middle schoolers that your DNA controls your whole body, that's not fucking true, but it's a great way to introduce the concept and get them started. And if you go to a college genetics class and try to present a paper that says your DNA controls everything in your body, it's not going to work, because it's more complicated than that. And if you get into an argument and say, I learned in middle school your DNA controls your whole body, you're going to look foolish. And it's the same exact thing when we talk about sex and gender. It's just more complicated than high school would let you to believe. Yeah, humans are far more interesting than people like to admit.
Right. So in a certain sense, I think the pat response that you have to carry around in your back pocket is just, it's complicated. It's complicated.
Yeah.
Like, if you can't speak on it with that level of sophistication, then maybe we don't need to listen. But I also recognize that there is just a lot of very politically motivated junk science out there. So are there any good philosophical razors you can give us to just help sort out some of that bad information without having to memorize all of the books that you're pouring through?
So I actually missed a part of your last question, and it applies here. So
Sure.
I'm gonna answer your question like this.
Let's do it.
So when you talked about hormones, and you talked about developmental things, and how people, their hardware and their software, you said, are mismatched. You know, estrogen in utero, when you're a fetus developing, if you are a female, you have to have a special protein that binds estrogen and stops it from getting to your brain, because estrogen will give you what you would call a male brain. Now, this is, the whole idea of like boy brains and girl brains is kind of, it gets in that area where very quickly people take it and turn it into woo-woo science. Kind of like when we talk about like energy or frequencies or things like that.
Sure.
And like, there's a lot of real science to talk about here. And then some people are like, I have a crystal in my pocket that wins the lottery. And like, so like when we talk about like male and female neural
that whole like waffle versus bowl of spaghetti thing has been, I don't know if the audience knows that or not. That's been thoroughly
I know exactly
debunked,
what
right?
you mean.
Okay.
Yes, that's bullshit. That's all bullshit. So like the way that, because a lot of that comes down to culture as well. There's a whole thing. Anyway, but like there is some reality to like minor differences in the neural architecture of a male versus a female brain. And again, this is very binary split, just in the way we're talking about this. I am oversimplifying a lot of things here.
Sure.
If you think I'm giving you the full story, you are wrong. I'm just trying to get through a talking point here. Is like, so when we look at differences between males and female brain, we see certain differences, patches in neurons the size of a grain of rice that vary a little bit. And we see consistently that, like, when you look at trans people, for example, their brains match their gender identity, not their genitalia. And so this isn't the case of this person just decided they want to be a girl today. This is a woman who literally has the wrong body as far as they're concerned. This is an actual thing going on. And you look at the history, this is where now we get into what you were just asking. When you look at like the history of the way that we talked about psychology, for the longest time, being a homosexual was considered a psychological disorder. For there's a long period of time where psychologists would try to cure homosexuality. We talked about it being illegal for a long time. And then when we came to understand with better research that this is something that is not in somebody's control, certainly is not a disorder, certainly doesn't hinder somebody being happy unless they grow up in an extremely regressive and shitty life.
Unless we make them be.
Right. This is actually just a totally acceptable and surprisingly common way to be a person. We erased this from the DSM, whatever, and it was at the time. And that all of a sudden now millions of people were cured of a mental disease that we thought they had because it turns out it didn't exist in the first place. And so now when we look at things like, being trans, we look at things like gender dysphoria, when we look at things, body dysmorphia that goes along with these things, we look at all these different things. And I hesitate to use too many psychological terms because that is not my area of expertise.
I'll call you out if I need to.
Yeah, I want to make sure that I'm not using a term that somebody's like, that's not quite the same thing, and I give bad information. I'm not a psychologist; I'm a biologist. But when we look at these issues, it's the exact same thing. As we get more information, we're finding out more and more. Oh shit! This isn't just a girl who wanted to be a boy. This is a boy who, for some reason, got a vagina. What do we do about this? Maybe the best option would be to ask him. And then he'll decide what he wants to do with his body. And that is the frontier that we're at now, is that science is clear that like, oh shit, okay, this is not just some mental disease. This is not just some crazy person. Now the problem is, what do we do about it? How are we going to treat these people? How are we going to bring them into our society? Are we going to bring them into our society at all? What are we going to do about the fact that these people exist? And it seems like really, really obnoxious to me that we're at a day and age where we still have to be arguing over who it is and isn't okay to discriminate against. But at least that's the last frontier where we have to cross this path and be like, okay, I guess maybe we should let them control their own destinies and then we'll go from there.
Yeah.
That's a radical idea.
No, I mean, the idea is certainly out there, and it's good to know that some people are starting to attach to it. We'll see where the trend lines all head, but the information is being gathered, and that gives me some courage at a minimum. We can talk about, social media and its usefulness and these different things, but at a minimum, social media has the ability to disseminate a research study that's being done now. And that hasn't always been the thing, that this information is being collected. So yeah, I'm excited. I'm hopeful.
It allows us to support people just by existing as well, which is kind of cool. Like you can see on the screen here, we have our pronouns on the square. There it is. There it says he, him, because those are my pronouns. I don't have to give those out. I am a cisgendered, mostly straight white man, right? This is all I need. I don't need to say shit. But by me doing that and normalizing the practice, I'm no longer having someone who does share their pronouns. Now they're kind of outing themselves a little bit. That could be an issue. And also it makes it less weird to have to ask and less weird to have to tell. And so like, this is a way that everybody can participate in a revolutionary change of acceptance and making people like just cool with who they are. And remember, it's acceptance, not tolerance, because I don't want to fucking be tolerated. I want to be loved. So like, this is, a great way through social media. Yeah, exactly.
This is not a difficult or challenging thing. And I think that has to undergird everything that we're talking about. Like, yes, we should trust that trans man to, control his own destiny and to talk about his own body just philosophically, but also the people who are so upset and going so out of their way around these issues. I mean, that's a whole separate topic, but the ACA received a email complaining about, putting the pronouns up there on the screen that I got to respond to. And I got into a little bit of a correspondence. And I think we were about 3 or 4 emails deep before I had to stop and point out like, hey friend, like we've been emailing back and forth for a while. I know my email signature says Christy and doesn't have my pronouns in it. Here's a picture of me with a big old fucking beard. Your assumption has been wrong this whole time, and it could have been solved by this thing that you've been complaining about.
Exactly.